A life of struggles. Jason Thornton sat in his cramped apartment, the dim light from a flickering lamp casting long shadows across the worn-out furniture. It had been a long day, and every muscle in his body ached from the hours of bending over car engines and trying to fix rusted-out machines. The grease that stained his fingers seemed to mock him, a constant reminder of his current life, one of struggle, monotony, and unfulfilled dreams. He glanced over at the small kitchen counter where a stack of overdue bills lay. They seemed to grow taller every day, taunting him with their relentless demands. The rent, the utilities, the medical bills for his mother, Clara, each one a weight on his shoulders that seemed impossible to lift. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound breaking the heavy silence of the apartment. Even the city outside, which buzzed with life, felt far removed from the confines of his small world. "Mom, I'm home," Jason called softly as he walked through the door into the small hallway, his voice carrying an air of exhaustion. A faint voice responded from the bedroom. "In here, sweetie." Jason's heart tightened as he made his way to his mother's room. Clara lay on her bed, the sheets neatly tucked around her frail form, but her face, once lively and full of warmth, was now pale, with deep lines etched around her eyes. She was a woman in her late 50s, yet she looked far older due to the toll that years of illness had taken on her, a constant reminder of the fragility of life. She had been battling chronic illness for the past few years, and Jason had been her primary caregiver since the beginning. Despite her deteriorating health, Clara tried to keep up a brave front, even if only for Jason's sake. She looked at him with a smile, her tired eyes lighting up at the sight of her son. "Did you have a good day, Jason?" He forced a smile, sitting down beside her. "Same old, Mom. Same old. How about you?" Clara's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her medication bottle. "You know, just trying to keep going. I'll be all right." She tried to make light of it, but Jason could tell it was getting harder and harder for her to hide the strain. Jason's heart ached seeing her like this. He wanted to tell her everything would be okay, that one day they'd be out of this apartment and living comfortably. But those words felt hollow, knowing that the mounting bills would soon swallow them whole if something didn't change. "I'll make dinner," Jason offered, standing up and heading toward the kitchen. He had grown used to the routine of making sure his mother was well taken care of. It was his only purpose. As he opened the fridge, he sighed when he saw its meager contents: a few cartons of expired milk, half a loaf of bread, and some wilted vegetables. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He pulled out a can of beans and began heating it up on the stove, the smell of metal and preservatives filling the air. He tried not to dwell on how far he had fallen since his younger days, when he had dreams of something more: a successful career, a home of his own, a life filled with comfort and security. But that all seemed so distant now. The past few years had been one setback after another, each one crushing whatever hope he had left. The mechanic job barely paid enough to cover the bills, and any dreams of going back to school or starting his own business had withered away, strangled by reality. He had tried to save money for his mother's treatments, but the expenses piled up faster than he could manage. Every time he thought he was getting ahead, something else would go wrong. Jason rubbed his temples, feeling a headache coming on. He knew what the problem was. He had to get out. There was no future here for him, no hope of breaking free from this cycle. The more he worked, the further into debt he sank. He had no skills that would help him rise above his station, and with his mother's health continuing to worsen, time was running out. He couldn't spend another day feeling like this, stuck in the same old place with no way out. That's when he thought of Elizabeth Sinclair. Elizabeth was a name he had heard around town for years. A successful businesswoman in her early 60s, Elizabeth was known for her fortune and her ability to build an empire from nothing. She owned a chain of luxury spas and wellness centers, and her influence spread far beyond the small town they lived in. Jason had never met her personally, but he had seen her at a few high society events he had managed to attend. Even if only as an outsider, lingering in the background, unnoticed. She was everything Jason wasn't: powerful, wealthy, and graceful. There was something magnetic about her. Her poised demeanor, her elegant style, the way people flocked to her with admiration. It was clear she had everything, and Jason had nothing. He had fantasized about what it would be like to live her life, to have the kind of wealth that would erase every worry, every burden. Jason had made a decision. He was going to do whatever it took to be a part of her world. He'd spent the last few weeks thinking about it, carefully considering his options. He had nothing to lose, and if Elizabeth could offer him the escape he so desperately needed, then he would take it. It wasn't love that drew him to her. That was an illusion he would create, a front that would allow him to slip under her radar. Jason knew that Elizabeth, like many women of her age, would be looking for companionship, someone to ease her loneliness, someone to keep her company. What she didn't know was that Jason wasn't interested in her for who she was. He was interested in her for what she had. Jason had no illusions about the future. His plan was simple: marry Elizabeth, play the part of the devoted husband, and wait for her to pass on. Once she was gone, he would inherit everything: her businesses, her wealth, her entire life's work. It would be easy. Elizabeth was in her 60s, and he figured a few years of pretending to care about her wouldn't be that difficult. The more Jason thought about it, the more the plan seemed like a perfect solution to all his problems. He could finally live the life he'd always dreamed of: money, freedom, luxury. He could take care of his mother without worrying about bills or debts. He could leave this small apartment behind and never look back. All he needed to do was play the part, charm her, make her fall in love with him. And in a few short years, he would have everything. Jason finished cooking the meager dinner and brought it to his mother, forcing a smile as he placed the plate in front of her. "Here you go, Mom," he said softly, taking a seat beside her. Clara smiled at him, her tired eyes reflecting gratitude. "Thank you, Jason. You always take such good care of me." Jason nodded, his heart heavy with guilt. How could he tell her the truth? How could he admit that the only way he saw out of this life was through deceit? As he sat there, watching his mother eat, he wondered if he was making the right choice. But then he reminded himself he had to do this, for both of them. And once Elizabeth's wealth was his, everything would change. It was the only way out. The seed had been planted, and there was no turning back. A dangerous game. Jason was no stranger to calculated moves. He had learned early on that in a world like this, survival required more than just hard work. It demanded cunning, persistence, and sometimes the ability to manipulate those around you. He had spent weeks carefully studying Elizabeth Sinclair, observing her habits, her mannerisms, and the subtle ways in which she interacted with the world. Jason knew that he would have to be strategic. His plan was simple: gain her trust, win her affection, and ultimately secure his place in her life. But in doing so, Jason was beginning to walk a path he never fully understood. It was a late spring afternoon when Jason's first real opportunity to strike presented itself. He had finally secured an invitation to one of Elizabeth's exclusive social gatherings, an elegant cocktail event held at her grand estate. The kind of gathering where the rich and influential people of the town mingled over wine and whispered secrets. Jason had only glimpsed the luxurious life from afar, but tonight he would be among them. His stomach fluttered with a mix of excitement and trepidation as he adjusted his black suit in the mirror. Standing in front of the mirror, Jason scrutinized himself. He had dressed to impress, his suit tailored perfectly to his lean frame, his hair neatly styled, and his posture straight. But beneath the polished exterior was a man whose every action was motivated by ambition and desperation. He couldn't help but remind himself of why he was here: to win Elizabeth's heart and eventually take everything she had worked so hard for. When Jason arrived at the event, he was immediately struck by the contrast between his humble background and the opulence surrounding him. The estate itself was a sprawling mansion, its exterior lit by soft golden lights that created a surreal glow against the twilight sky. Guests in designer suits and sparkling dresses sipped champagne from crystal flutes, laughing and exchanging stories. The walls were adorned with priceless art, and the air smelled of fresh flowers and expensive perfumes. For a brief moment, Jason felt out of place. He was a fish in a tank of sharks. But he knew how to swim. He made his way through the crowd, nodding politely to those who greeted him, all while keeping his focus on Elizabeth. She was standing across the room, talking to a group of women, her laughter ringing out like music. Her beauty was timeless, her confidence magnetic. She was the queen of this world, and Jason was just a pawn, biding his time until he could make his move. Elizabeth noticed him before he had the chance to approach. There was a glimmer of recognition in her eyes, but it quickly faded into curiosity. Jason had made sure to catch her attention, not by rushing in, but by standing at the edge of the group and waiting for the right moment. When she excused herself from the conversation and began to walk toward him, Jason's heart beat faster. This was it, his chance to impress her, his chance to charm her into believing that he was the man she had been waiting for. Jason, isn't it? Elizabeth's voice was smooth, her tone warm but reserved. She extended her hand, and Jason took it, shaking it firmly but gently, making sure to maintain eye contact. "That's right, Mrs. Sinclair. It's a pleasure to meet you in person." Jason's voice was steady, confident. His eyes never left hers. "Please, call me Elizabeth," she said, smiling slightly. "I've heard so much about you." Jason raised an eyebrow, feigning modesty. "I can't imagine what you've heard, but I'm sure it's all exaggerated." Elizabeth chuckled softly, her eyes studying him with an intensity that made Jason slightly uncomfortable. But he pushed the feeling aside. This was his moment, and he had to make it count. As the night progressed, Jason and Elizabeth spent more time together. They talked about a range of subjects: her career, his life, their shared love of classic films, and even a few intimate stories about their childhoods. Jason listened attentively, asking the right questions, and subtly weaving in his own anecdotes that painted him as a hard-working, down-to-earth man. Elizabeth, in turn, seemed to enjoy his company. She was intrigued by his youth, his ambition, and the genuine way he seemed to care about her thoughts and experiences. Jason felt a pang of guilt. Was he truly manipulating her, or was there something more genuine developing between them? But he quickly pushed the thought aside. This was business, not romance. Jason was careful not to overstep. He didn't rush things, didn't try to rush into a more intimate connection than what was comfortable. He knew that to gain Elizabeth's trust, he had to make her feel safe, respected, and admired. Every compliment he paid her felt natural. Every laugh they shared seemed effortless. And yet, every word he spoke carried the weight of his true intentions. By the end of the evening, Elizabeth was practically glowing. She invited Jason to join her for a private drink on the terrace. They stood side by side, looking out over the vast gardens, the moonlight reflecting off the glistening water in the distant fountains. "You know, Jason," Elizabeth said softly, taking a sip of her wine, "you're unlike anyone I've met before. Most people I meet only want something from me. But you seem different. There's something real about you." Jason's heart skipped a beat. This was exactly the response he had been hoping for, the validation he needed to confirm that his plan was working. But there was something else in her words, something he hadn't expected. Was it a hint of loneliness? A desire for connection that went beyond wealth and status? "I'm not interested in what you have, Elizabeth," Jason said, his voice low and sincere. He made sure his gaze met hers, not out of manipulation, but in an effort to appear genuine. "I'm interested in you, in the person you are, and the life you've built. I admire that more than anything." Elizabeth was silent for a moment, her eyes searching his face. Jason could see the wheels turning in her mind. She was weighing his words, trying to decipher his true motives. But she said nothing, just smiled softly and nodded. "Well, thank you for saying that, Jason," she replied, her voice tinged with a hint of vulnerability. "It means more to me than you know." For the first time, Jason felt a pang of doubt. He had gone into this with a plan. But now, as he looked at Elizabeth, something stirred in him. Her elegance, her strength, her intelligence. She wasn't just a wealthy woman to him anymore. She was someone who had fought her way to the top, someone who understood the value of hard work and perseverance. He had thought that using her for her wealth was the answer. But now, the lines were beginning to blur. Still, Jason knew he had to stay focused. He had no choice but to keep playing the game. He couldn't afford to lose sight of his ultimate goal. The night ended with a soft kiss on the cheek, a promise to meet again soon. As Jason left Elizabeth's mansion, his mind raced. He had made significant progress, but the deeper he got involved, the more complicated the situation became. He was beginning to question just how far he was willing to go for wealth and security. But then, the reality of his life, the bills, the debt, his mother's health, brought him back to the cold, hard truth. This wasn't just a game. It was his only chance at a better life. The ties that bind. Jason's life began to shift in ways he had never anticipated. What had once been a simple plan, get close to Elizabeth, secure his position, and walk away with her fortune, was slowly morphing into something much more tangled. The lines between manipulation and genuine affection were blurring, and Jason couldn't help but feel the weight of it all pressing on his chest. Every meeting with Elizabeth felt like a dance, an intricate exchange of words and emotions that Jason was beginning to struggle to keep up with. He had initially prided himself on his ability to control situations, but with each passing day, Elizabeth seemed to elude his grasp. There was something about her presence that was magnetic, something that made Jason feel both at ease and profoundly uncomfortable. It wasn't just her wealth or her beauty that pulled him in. Elizabeth had a way of making him feel seen, like he wasn't just another mechanic, another man who had stumbled into her world. She listened to him. She asked him questions about his life, his dreams, and in return, Jason found himself divulging more than he ever thought he would. He had told her about his mother's illness, about the crushing debt he was struggling to pay off, about the way he had sacrificed everything to care for his family. He had never spoken about those things to anyone, not even his closest friends. But with Elizabeth, it felt different. She didn't pity him. She didn't offer empty words of encouragement. Instead, she seemed to understand. She nodded with empathy, her sharp eyes softening when he spoke about the hardships he had endured. In those moments, it almost felt like they were equals, both navigating difficult worlds in search of something more. One evening, after several weeks of subtle flirtation and carefully orchestrated meetings, Jason was invited to Elizabeth's private dinner. It was a small, intimate gathering. A few of her closest friends and business partners, people who had known her for years. The table was set in her grand dining room, the soft golden light from crystal chandeliers casting an almost ethereal glow over the meal. It was nothing like Jason had ever experienced. Fine china, delicate silverware, perfectly prepared dishes. Everything was precisely in place. Even the air smelled of luxury. Jason felt out of place as he sat at the table, his palms sweating despite the coolness of the room. He had learned to blend in at these events, to speak the language of the wealthy. But tonight felt different. Tonight, there was a different kind of energy in the air. Elizabeth was by his side, her presence a calm reassurance amidst the sea of unfamiliar faces. As the evening wore on, Jason became more aware of the subtle looks exchanged between Elizabeth and some of her guests. They were her world, people who had helped her build her empire. They were the people who had shared her triumphs and setbacks. And then there was Jason, the outsider, the newcomer who had only recently entered her life with a single purpose in mind. It was during a quiet moment, as the guests sipped on expensive wine and the conversation shifted to business matters, that Elizabeth leaned closer to him. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Jason, Do you ever feel like you're living in two different worlds? Jason was taken aback by the question. He had expected small talk, polite compliments, but this felt different. She was searching for something deeper. What do you mean? He asked, feigning ignorance. Elizabeth's eyes flickered briefly to the others around the table before returning to him. You come from a different place than I do. I can see it in the way you carry yourself. There's a quiet intensity about you, as if you're constantly assessing everything around you. Jason didn't know how to respond. Should he deny it? Should he pretend to be just like the others, blending in seamlessly? But he didn't want to lie to her. Not entirely. Not tonight. Instead, he gave a small, knowing smile. I suppose I've always had to be observant. Growing up the way I did, you learned to read people, to understand their motivations. Elizabeth studied him for a long moment. Jason couldn't tell what she was thinking. Was she testing him? Had she figured out more than he was willing to admit? She didn't speak for several moments, and when she did, her voice was soft yet resolute. Jason, I don't want to rush into anything, but I'm beginning to see you in a different light. I know we haven't known each other for long, but something about you feels genuine. And that's rare in my world. Jason's heart raced. This was exactly what he had hoped for. Her admiration, her affection. But it felt different now. Was he getting too close? Was he beginning to feel something for her that he had no right to? Before he could answer, the conversation turned back to business, and Elizabeth pulled away, her smile never faltering. Jason's mind was spinning, caught between the lie he was telling her and the feelings he couldn't deny. This was no longer just about money. He was becoming entangled in something he had never anticipated. Real emotions, real connections, but there was no going back now. The plan was set, and he couldn't afford to hesitate. As weeks passed, Jason and Elizabeth's relationship deepened. They spent more time together, their conversations becoming increasingly personal. Elizabeth took him on trips to her vacation home, invited him to exclusive events, and introduced him to key people in her life. Jason played the role of the devoted partner, always attentive, always respectful. But with each passing day, the guilt weighed heavier on his conscience. He had begun to care for her, to see her not as a means to an end, but as a person who had earned everything she had through years of hard work and determination. One afternoon, while they were walking through the garden of her estate, Elizabeth stopped in front of a massive fountain. The sound of water cascading over stone filled the air, and for a moment, they stood in silence. Elizabeth turned to him, her expression unreadable. Jason, I've been thinking a lot about us. About you, she began, and I know we've been spending a lot of time together. But I need to ask you something. What is it that you really want? Jason's heart stuttered in his chest. He had been preparing for this moment, but now that it had arrived, he wasn't sure how to answer. He couldn't lie to her, not fully. But could he tell her the truth? I want to be with you, he said, his voice steady, though a small part of him hesitated. I want to be a part of your world, your life. Elizabeth's gaze softened, but there was a glimmer of something deeper in her eyes, a knowing look, as though she could see through him. I see, but I need more than just words, Jason. I need to know that you're here for the right reasons. Jason nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. You have my word. I care about you, Elizabeth. I'm here for you. For a brief moment, he thought he saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by a smile that felt both genuine and heavy with unspoken meaning. Well then, she said softly, her hand resting gently on his arm. Let's see where this goes. As they continued their walk, Jason couldn't help but feel the tightening grip of his deception. He had become too invested in the lie to back out now. But deep inside, there was a part of him that wondered. If he let his guard down, if he allowed himself to truly care for Elizabeth, what would happen? Could he still go through with his plan? Or had he already lost himself in the very world he had sought to conquer? The unraveling. As days turned into weeks, Jason found himself standing at the precipice of a life he had never envisioned. His interactions with Elizabeth had become more frequent, more personal. He had carefully crafted a picture of himself, a man of integrity, hard work, and devotion. And Elizabeth, despite her keen intelligence and sharp instincts, seemed to have fallen for it. At least, that's what Jason told himself. But the deeper he delved into their relationship, the more complicated things became. Elizabeth was not just the wealthy woman he had imagined her to be. She was a force of nature, independent, ambitious, and driven by a need to prove herself to a world that had long dismissed her as nothing more than a woman of privilege. Jason had underestimated her. Her sharp mind saw through the veneers of the world, and somewhere deep within him, Jason feared she might see through him too. Their relationship had entered a new phase. It wasn't just about dinners and drinks anymore. Elizabeth had begun to lean on him in ways that made Jason's heart race with both excitement and fear. He wasn't used to being needed in this way. She began to trust him with parts of herself that she had kept hidden from everyone else, including her most vulnerable thoughts and insecurities. It was late one evening when it all began to come to a head. Jason had just returned from a grueling day at work. His hands were rough from hours of manual labor, and the tiredness weighed on him like a heavy blanket. His mother, Linda, had been in and out of the hospital, and every time Jason left her side, the guilt gnawed at him. But he couldn't show that side to Elizabeth. Not now, not when everything was so close to coming together. He arrived at Elizabeth's mansion, his usual calm demeanor betraying the chaos inside his head. Tonight, she had invited him to dinner again, just the two of them. She had recently been through a particularly difficult business negotiation, and Jason had offered to accompany her for some support, though he hadn't been certain what kind of support she needed from him: emotional, financial, or something else entirely. As he entered the grand dining room, he was met with the familiar sight of the long oak table, the elegant silverware, the crystal glasses filled with expensive wine. But tonight, it felt different. The space, so often filled with polite conversation and the clink of utensils, seemed empty. The silence hung heavy between them, as Elizabeth sat at the far end of the table, her back straight, her expression unreadable. Jason could sense that something was off, but he didn't know how to address it. Instead, he walked toward her, his movements slow and deliberate, as though moving through a fog. Elizabeth, for her part, did not look up from the papers scattered in front of her. He could see the sharp edge of frustration on her face, the furrow in her brow, as she read through yet another contract. She was lost in her world of business, a world Jason had tried so hard to break into. But tonight, something in her was distant, unreachable. Elizabeth. Jason's voice broke through the silence, sounding almost too soft for the grand room. She looked up at him, her gaze sharp, almost piercing. For a moment, it felt like she was seeing straight through him. "Jason," she said, her voice colder than usual. "I'm glad you're here. I've been thinking about us." Jason's heart skipped a beat. The words hung in the air like a warning. He could feel the ground shifting beneath his feet, but he didn't know why. "I don't know if I can keep pretending, Jason," Elizabeth continued, her tone laced with uncertainty. "These past few months have been interesting, but there's something I need to understand. What do you want from me? I need to know what this is, what we are, because it feels like you're holding something back." Jason's stomach churned. The carefully constructed facade he had worked so hard to build was beginning to crumble. He had expected this conversation, but the weight of it was heavier than he anticipated. How could he keep lying? How could he continue to play the game, knowing that Elizabeth was beginning to see through him? I don't know what you mean," Jason stammered, trying to maintain his composure, but his voice betrayed him. Elizabeth studied him for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly as she leaned forward. "You don't have to lie to me, Jason. I can feel it. Something isn't right. You've been so focused on everything I've built, on what I can offer you. But I want more than that. I want to know who you are. What are you really after? The question hit him like a punch to the gut. It was the one question he had been dreading, the one question he hadn't been prepared to answer. Jason opened his mouth, but no words came out. What could he say? Could he tell her the truth? Could he admit that his motives had been selfish from the very beginning? Instead, he fell back on the lies he had told himself. I'm not after anything, Elizabeth. I just want to be with you. I've told you this before. Elizabeth's eyes softened, but the doubt in her expression didn't fade. But is that the truth, Jason? Or is it what you want me to believe? Jason felt the ground beneath him begin to shake. He couldn't lie to her anymore. He couldn't continue with this charade and expect to walk away unscathed. And yet, the thought of losing everything, his mother's well-being, his debts, the life he had been struggling to build, was more than he could bear. Just then, the doorbell rang, breaking the tension that had been growing between them. Jason looked up, startled by the interruption, and Elizabeth seemed to hesitate for a moment before excusing herself from the table. I'll be right back, she said, standing up and walking toward the door. But before she reached it, she paused and turned back to Jason. Think about what I said, she added quietly, before leaving him alone in the room. Jason sat there in the silence, the weight of her words pressing down on him. His mind raced, thoughts spiraling out of control. He had been playing a dangerous game from the beginning. But now, for the first time, he wasn't sure if he could win. Elizabeth's trust, something he had been so careful to cultivate, was slipping away, and the consequences of his actions, the lies he had woven into their relationship, were catching up with him faster than he could have ever imagined. The door swung open, and Jason was brought back to the present. A tall, well-dressed man entered, his features sharp and professional. He was clearly someone important, someone who belonged in Elizabeth's world. Jason's stomach dropped, realizing that the conversation he had just been having with her wasn't just a personal matter. Elizabeth had been preparing herself for something far more significant. Jason's heart began to race as he realized that his window of opportunity was closing. Elizabeth wasn't just questioning him. She was preparing to confront him, to strip away the layers of deception he had carefully built. But could he keep up the facade, or was he about to face the consequences of his actions? The mirror cracks. Jason stood in the dimly lit room, the soft hum of conversation from the hallway outside seeping through the walls. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts, each one more chaotic than the last. He had spent years trying to escape the poverty that had defined his life, striving to secure a future where he would no longer be burdened by the weight of debts and illness. The plan had been simple: marry Elizabeth, take her fortune, and walk away with everything he needed to change the course of his life. But now, standing on the precipice of everything he had worked for, he found himself questioning it all. Elizabeth had left the room abruptly, leaving him alone with his thoughts, and the silence that followed felt suffocating. For the first time since their relationship began, Jason felt exposed, like a man stripped of his carefully constructed armor. She had seen through the cracks in his facade, and it terrified him. She had always been perceptive, but now it seemed as though she could see right into his soul. He paced the room, his palms slick with sweat. The familiar rush of panic that had always accompanied his struggles began to rise within him. What would happen now? Could he salvage this, or was it too late? The sound of footsteps in the hallway snapped him from his thoughts. Elizabeth's voice drifted toward him, low and serious, but he couldn't make out the words. He knew the conversation she was having was important, likely the kind of conversation that would determine whether or not he would be a part of her life moving forward. He had been living in the shadows of his deception for so long that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to stand in the light of truth. A knock at the door startled him. It was soft, tentative, but Jason felt it reverberate through him like a drumbeat. He had no choice but to face what was coming. He opened the door to find Elizabeth standing there, her eyes cold but unreadable. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. Jason nodded, his throat tight. He stepped aside, allowing her to enter. They stood in the center of the room for a moment, the tension between them thick and palpable. Elizabeth didn't sit down. Instead, she crossed her arms, her gaze fixed on him like a hawk preparing to strike. Jason couldn't meet her eyes. He felt too exposed, too vulnerable. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said earlier," Elizabeth began, her voice steady, but tinged with a hint of something Jason couldn't quite place. Disappointment, perhaps, or something deeper. About who you really are. About why you're here. Jason swallowed hard. The words he had been rehearsing in his mind suddenly felt inadequate, weak. He had always been good at manipulating situations, at spinning stories to fit his narrative. But now, with Elizabeth standing before him, he didn't know how to spin this. How could he explain that everything he had built with her was a lie? How could he admit to the deepest part of himself that he had wanted her for her money all along? "Elizabeth," Jason began, his voice faltering, "I never meant to hurt you. I didn't plan for any of this to happen. When I met you, I was just trying to survive." He stopped himself, unable to continue. The truth, the one he had avoided for so long, was now at the tip of his tongue, but he couldn't bring himself to say it. Elizabeth took a step closer, her expression unreadable. "Jason, you don't have to keep pretending. I know you've been using me. I can see it in your eyes." Jason's heart dropped into his stomach. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. He had been found out. There was no escaping it now. He had hoped, in some small part of himself, that he could continue the charade, convince her that his feelings were real, that everything he had said to her was true. But Elizabeth wasn't fooled. She was too smart for that. "I didn't want it to be like this," Jason said quietly, the weight of his confession settling on his shoulders like a leaden cloak. "But I thought if I could just get close enough, if I could just play my cards right, everything would be different. My mom, she's sick, and we're drowning in debt. I thought I could fix it all by being with you." The truth hung between them, raw and unvarnished. Jason's eyes filled with a mixture of shame and desperation as he looked at Elizabeth. He had expected her to be angry, to lash out at him in fury. But instead, there was something else in her eyes, something he couldn't quite identify, something that made his stomach twist. Elizabeth didn't say anything for a long moment. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Jason could feel his pulse hammering in his ears as he waited for her to respond, unsure of what she would do next. Finally, Elizabeth spoke, her voice steady, but tinged with sadness. "You came into my life with a plan, Jason, and I understand that. Life's not easy, especially for someone like you, someone trying to keep their head above water. But I don't understand why you thought you could fool me. You're not the first person to try." Jason flinched at the words, but Elizabeth wasn't finished. "I've seen it all before, the manipulation, the charm, the carefully crafted persona. And I've learned the hard way that when people want something from you, they'll stop at nothing to get it. I won't be another Mark, Jason. Not again." Her words cut through him like a knife, and Jason realized in that moment that he had underestimated her. Elizabeth was not the helpless woman he had thought she was. She had built her empire on her own, had fought for everything she had. And she wasn't about to let him take it from her. "I didn't mean to hurt you," Jason whispered, his voice breaking. I thought maybe I could fix everything. Maybe I could fix us." Elizabeth shook her head slowly, her eyes now filled with a kind of quiet resolve. "You don't fix things by lying to people. You don't fix things by taking advantage of their trust. If you truly cared about me, you would never have done this." Jason stood there in stunned silence, the weight of his actions settling over him like a heavy cloud. He had known all along that this moment would come, the moment when the truth would have to be faced. But now that it had arrived, he was unprepared for the finality of it. He had been so consumed by his own needs, by his desperation to escape, that he had failed to see Elizabeth for who she truly was. She wasn't just a rich woman to be used. She was a person, with her own dreams, her own fears, her own heart. Elizabeth stepped back, her posture straightening as she regained her composure. "I think it's time for you to go, Jason." Jason's heart shattered at the words. He had known this was coming, but hearing her say it aloud made it real. His world, which had once seemed so secure, was now crumbling around him. He opened his mouth to protest, to beg her to give him another chance, but no words came. Instead, he turned away, walking toward the door with slow, heavy steps. As he left the mansion, the cool night air did nothing to ease the suffocating feeling in his chest. He had lost everything: his chance at a better life, the woman he had once admired, and most painfully, the chance to redeem himself. But the story wasn't over yet. Jason knew that he couldn't keep running from the consequences of his actions. He would have to face what he had done, no matter how hard it was. The final reckoning. Jason wandered through the dark streets, the night air biting against his skin. His steps were slow and heavy, each one echoing in the empty space around him, as though the world itself had turned its back on him. The weight of his actions had settled in, pulling at him with a force that was almost unbearable. He had been so sure of himself, so confident that his plan would work. But now, as he walked through the cold night, there was no certainty left. The world felt distant, like a cruel reflection of the life he had once dreamed of. As he walked, he replayed the events of the evening over and over in his mind, each word Elizabeth had spoken cutting through him like a blade. Her calm, almost detached demeanor when she had asked him to leave had only amplified the pain. She hadn't yelled, hadn't cried, hadn't given him any of the reactions he expected. Instead, there was only a quiet sadness in her eyes, and that perhaps was the worst part. Jason had lied to her. He had built an entire relationship on false pretenses, and now, with the weight of his guilt bearing down on him, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was no way to fix it. Elizabeth wasn't just any woman. She was a force of nature, someone who had built her own empire from the ground up. Jason hadn't respected that. He hadn't seen her for who she truly was. He had seen her only as a means to an end, a way out of the life he was desperately trying to escape. He stopped in front of the small apartment he called home. The familiar sight of the rundown building filled him with shame. His mother's health had been deteriorating for months, and Jason had been so focused on his scheme with Elizabeth that he had barely noticed the toll it was taking on her. The truth was, he had never really cared for her as he should have. All along, it had been about him. His future, his survival, his escape from the life he had been born into. With a sigh, he opened the door to the apartment, the smell of old furniture and stale air hitting him like a punch in the gut. Inside, Linda lay in her usual spot on the couch, watching TV with a faraway look in her eyes. She had never been a particularly expressive woman, but tonight there was something different in her gaze, a sadness that hadn't been there before. "Mom," Jason said softly, his voice faltering as he walked toward her. "How are you feeling?" Linda didn't respond at first. She simply stared at him, as though considering something. After a long pause, she turned her gaze to him and offered a small, tired smile. "I'm fine, sweetie," she said, though the words didn't quite match the look in her eyes. There was something more in her tone, a sadness that Jason couldn't ignore. Jason sat down beside her, running a hand through his hair as he tried to find the right words. The truth, the full truth, was something he couldn't share with her. How could he tell his mother that he had betrayed the one person who had cared for him? That his plan, his desperate attempt to fix everything, had blown up in his face. "Mom, lied." Jason trailed off, the words dying in his throat. How could he explain what had happened with Elizabeth? How could he admit that his life had fallen apart, and that he was responsible for it all? "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice cracking. "I'm so sorry." Linda's eyes softened as she reached out to take his hand. She didn't ask any questions, didn't press him for answers. She simply held his hand, as though she understood without needing to know the details. It was a comfort he hadn't realized he needed until now. But even that comfort couldn't erase the gnawing guilt that had taken root inside him. He had let his mother down just as much as he had let Elizabeth down. "Jason, you don't need to apologize to me," Linda said softly, her voice filled with quiet understanding. "I know you're trying. I know you're doing the best you can." Jason closed his eyes, overwhelmed by a wave of emotion. He had never been good at expressing his feelings, never known how to connect with those around him in a meaningful way. But now, with everything he had done weighing heavily on him, he couldn't hold back any longer. "I've messed up, Mom," he whispered. "I don't know how to fix it. I don't know if I even can." Linda squeezed his hand, her grip strong despite her frailty. "We all make mistakes, Jason. It's how we learn from them that matters. But you've got to take responsibility for what you've done. No one can change the past, but we can always change the future." Her words, simple as they were, struck a chord within him. Jason sat back, taking in what she had said. He couldn't change the mistakes he had made. He couldn't undo the hurt he had caused Elizabeth. But perhaps, just perhaps, he could try to change the future. He could start by being honest. Honest with himself, with his mother, and with the people he had wronged. The next day, Jason found himself standing outside Elizabeth's mansion, his stomach churning with a mixture of dread and determination. The decision he had made the night before wasn't easy. He had spent hours thinking about it, weighing the risks and the consequences. But in the end, he knew there was only one thing left to do. He rang the doorbell, his heart pounding in his chest as he waited for someone to answer. He wasn't sure what he expected, but he wasn't ready for the look of surprise and wariness in Elizabeth's eyes when she opened the door. She had clearly been caught off guard by his appearance, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jason spoke. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice steady but filled with regret. "I've been lying to you from the beginning. I thought I could fool you, use you, and get away with it. But I can't. I've hurt you, and I'm sorry." Elizabeth didn't say anything at first, her gaze fixed on him as if searching for any signs of insincerity. But Jason didn't flinch. He didn't back down. He had come here to make things right, even if it meant facing the consequences of his actions. "I never wanted to hurt you," he continued, his voice quieter now. "I was just trying to survive. But that's no excuse for what I did. I've learned the hard way that I can't keep running from my mistakes." For a long moment, Elizabeth stood there in silence, her expression unreadable. Jason felt the weight of her scrutiny pressing down on him, but he didn't look away. He couldn't. Finally, she spoke, her voice low but firm. "I appreciate the apology, Jason, but it doesn't change anything. The trust is gone. You can't undo what you've done." Jason nodded, understanding that there was nothing he could say to fix the damage. But in that moment, he realized something important. He might not be able to change the past, but he could start to rebuild. He could learn from his mistakes and try to make things right, beginning with himself. As he turned to leave, Elizabeth's voice stopped him. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Jason, but it won't be here." Jason nodded once more, the finality of her words sinking in. But as he walked away from her mansion, he felt a strange sense of clarity. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with obstacles and challenges, but he wasn't the same man who had walked into her life months ago. He had learned the hard way that the truth couldn't be hidden forever, and while he couldn't undo the past, he could face the future with honesty and integrity. For the first time in a long while, Jason felt as though he had a chance to begin again.